Although Unity ECS 1.0 is out and Dots is essentially considered fully production ready at this point, there's still a number of things you can't yet natively do in Unity's entity component system. One of those things is UI. Of course, it's very important to have good UI in your game because it gives your player important information about what is going on in your game to allow them to properly make decisions about how they want to play things out. So for this setup, I have a little project built out using Unity's entity component system that's going to hold all the data and information about our game. Then we're going to use Unity's existing UI system, which has been around for many years, and we're going to control that with Unity MonoBehaviours. And I'm going to be showing you two different ways we can essentially bridge the gap to pass information from the ECS side over to the MonoBehaviour side. Now, in order to follow along with this video, I'd highly suggest that you have at least some background about what Unity ECS is all about. If you don't, I'll go ahead and point you to some references from Unity's official documentation, as well as my Unity ECS 1.0 tutorial video, which goes over how to create a full project using Unity ECS 1.0. And if you do find today's video interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel because I'm going to be showing you more videos like this one where we're going to be bridging the gap between existing Unity features such as the new input system and Cinemachine with Unity ECS. Okay, so to demonstrate how to use UI in Unity's entity component system, I've created this little sample scene where we have this player here and 3 enemies, and we can use the 1, 2, and 3 keys to go ahead and shoot off these little projectiles into the world. You see, the other thing that I have here is if I hit the escape key, we can show the player's stats, and right now they have 0 experience points. Now, one thing that you may have noticed is when we shoot out a projectile and it hits one of the enemies, a little damage icon will pop up above the head of the enemy. So it's just a regular, Unity world space UI component that's go ahead and doing that there. Now you'll see that if I actually hit an enemy a 3rd time, it's going to go ahead and actually destroy, and then it also gives the player 5 experience points. So if we look at the player one more time when I destroy this enemy, you'll see that a +5 experience points actually pops up above the player's head. We can also go ahead and check the UI here, and you'll see that the player's experience points are now up to 10. And then we'll go ahead and finish off this final enemy. And you see that the player's experience points is now up to 15. So in the introduction for this video, I mentioned that there were going to be 2 different ways for us to send data from the ECS side to our MonoBehaviour side. I'd like to just take a moment to go over those 2 approaches now. So the first one is what I call the event-based approach, where this is basically where something happens on the Unity ECS side, and then we send that information over to the MonoBehaviour side through an event. So we're going to be using this for all our world space UI damage icons, the damage icons that pop up above the enemy's heads when we hit them with the projectiles. And this is also what we're going to be using for the +5 experience when a player actually finishes off one of the enemies. So we're going to have a system base over on the Unity ECS side, and this is what's actually going to be dealing damage to the enemies and granting the player experience at the appropriate times. Also, it's going to fire off regular C# events, and these MonoBehaviours are going to listen for the events, and those MonoBehaviours are what's actually going to spawn the UI elements into the world. And then for this, I've chosen to use these C# action events to pass our data because it's an easy way just to set up a quick event and we can fire any data that we want to. So here's basically an example of how I have this set up. You'll see that I have the deal damage system, which of course is a system base. You'll see that I have the public action, which has types int and float3. On our on-deal damage event. So basically when our on-deal damage event is invoked, we're going to go ahead and pass in an integer and a float3 value into there. Now this is just a little bit of pseudocode, but you'll see that here I have this deal damage method, which takes in an integer for the damage amount and a float3 for the position. And then all we need to do is just make sure that we invoke this event passing in the proper data. Now over on the MonoBehaviour side, which I've kind of mocked out over on the right here, you'll see that in our onEnable, we're just going to go ahead and start listening for this event. And then when that event is actually invoked, then you'll see that it actually calls this deal damage UI function. And that's where we can actually set the properties for our UI and display the damage icon on screen. Now, the other approach that I'm going to be showcasing is what I call the read value approach. So basically we again have a MonoBehaviour, and this is going to read data over on the ECS side. So it's not necessarily anything on the ECS side pushing data to the MonoBehaviour, but rather the MonoBehaviour is going out to the entity side and reading data over there. So this is what I'm going to be using for for the screen space UI on the player stat screen to display, how much experience the player has at any given time. But this could also be used for something like a game over screen where you just want to read one time the value of the given stats for a particular run that a player might have had. But also you could update it constantly for something like a timer where you're just constantly polling the ECS side to see what the current value of that timer is, so you can always display the correct accurate information on the screen. So rather than the ECS side pushing data over to the MonoBehaviour, again we have the MonoBehaviour kind of taking control about when it needs to read the data from the ECS side. And so you can kind of see that there may be some different situations where you might want to use one approach over another. Now here's just a quick example about how I have this set up. So you'll see that over on the left here we have a data component for the character experience points, and then you'll see that over on the right this would basically be a function inside of a MonoBehaviour called the show stats menu. And then what it's basically going to do is we have our entity manager, and we can use that entity manager to say get the component data of type character experience points off of our player entity, and then we'll just get the actual underlying data value from that. Once we have that underlying data value, we can basically do whatever we want with that. So in this case, we're just going to go ahead and set our player experience text.text equal to player exp, and then passing in the actual data value that we're getting from the ECS side. So now let me show you a little bit more of a concrete example about how I have this exactly set up for this project. Now I have kind of a simple little combat system set up here, and I'm not going to be going really in depth on how to set up a combat system or anything like that right now, but I do just want to give you kind of a high level overview of it to just understand where the UI fits in the overall picture of something like a combat system. So this combat system actually consists of 3 different steps. So the first is the player attack system, and this is basically where we're reading the input from the player and determining when we want to spawn one of these projectiles into the world. Once the projectile has been spawned into the world, then the move projectile system takes over, and that's actually going to move the projectile into the world from its origin point to its destination point, which in this case is one of the enemies. Once it hits one of the enemies, then the third system will take over, which is the deal damage system, which is where we're actually applying damage to the enemy. And that's going to be the system-based system, which actually invokes our UI events. So starting with the player attack system, you'll see that this is an I system here. And by the way, if you aren't totally clear on the differences between an I system and a system base, I'll go ahead and point you to one of the recent videos that I made that goes over the differences between the two. And you'll see that basically we're just kind of doing some setup and on create and on start running here. But on update is where things really happen here. We're basically getting our player input. So basically if the player presses the 1, 2, or 3 key, we can basically just attack one of the enemies that we target. Now see that here I'm using Unity's old input system to gather input from the player. However, in a future video, I do plan on showing you how to use Unity's new input system with Unity ECS. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that one. And of course, the main part of this player attack system is this attack enemy method here. I'm not going to be going through everything line by line, but you'll see that basically we're just going to go ahead and first find the enemy that we need to attack. Once we have that, we can figure out the start and end positions of the projectile. After that, we're going to go ahead and actually spawn the projectile and set our initial projectile data here. A couple important things that we're keeping track of on our projectile is one for the target character, so that we know that once we hit the character, we know which character to actually apply damage to. One other thing we need to keep track of is the actual damage amount, so you know how strong is the player and how much damage it should deal when it actually hits the enemy. And then we also do need to keep track of the origin character, which in this case is just the player entity, and that's so we can actually add experience points to the player once we destroy the enemy. So next up is the move projectile system. You'll see that again, this is another I system. So you see that in our update here, basically we're going to do this idiomatic for each function here. This is basically just going to iterate across all the active projectiles in the world. First thing it's going to do is just going to go ahead and move the transform position forward. Now, if the projectile is near its target position, basically if it's within 0.25 meters, I basically determined that it's hit the enemy at that point. Again, there's better ways that we could make an actual collision system and things like that, but for this sample video, I'm just going to go ahead and just do a quick distance check here. Now, basically what we do once we get to this point is we're actually going to go ahead and add a component to the target character, which again is the enemy that we're targeting, and this component is the damage to character component. And this damage to character component again passes along some information, so it's passing along the actual damage amount, you know, how much should we actually deal damage to that particular character. and then who is the origin character, who is the character actually dealing that damage out. So then we'll go over to our deal damage system. Again, you'll see that this is a system base. This must be a system base because we couldn't use these C# actions like this in an I system. So you see that up at the top, we've defined our different events. So we have an on deal damage event and an on grant experience event. You see that these both have a type for an int, which is basically just the value of either the damage or experience points. And again, we have a float 3 about where is the world position where this UI should originate from. So inside our on update, we're just going to go ahead and do another idiomatic for each. This time it's going to be looping through any character who has a damage to character component. Again, in our move projectile system, once we've air quotes hit that enemy, we're going to go ahead and add this component to the particular enemy. So once an enemy has this component, then all this code is going to run against that enemy. So you see that the first thing that we're going to do here is we're just going to go ahead and subtract the damage value from its current hit points. So if let's say it started with 10 hit points and then we hit it once with a damage of 5, it's going to be down to 5 hit points. And then you see that pretty much right away we can just go ahead and invoke our on deal damage function. Again, we're passing in the damage to the character, so how much damage are we dealing with this particular hit, and then we can just pass in the transform position, which is the transform position of the enemy in this case. And then lastly, we just need to make sure that we remove the damage to character component, because we don't want this to be running every single frame. We only want the character to be damaged for just this one frame. Now, see if the player is out of health, there are a couple extra things that we need to do. For one, we actually need to go ahead and destroy the enemy. And then the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to add the experience points to our player. Once we've actually added the value of experience points to our player, you'll see that we can now just look up what the character's current position is, and then we can invoke our on grant experience function where we pass in the actual value of experience points to our player, as well as the player's position. So again, this is basically just the system base that's just firing out these events. We don't have anything actually listening to them yet, so they're not actually going to do anything. Now, before I move on, I'm just going to go ahead and show you how I have the UI set up in this project. By the way, if you do want to download the project files, you can do so using the links in the description below. So basically, I just have a world space UI canvas, which I've created. So of course, we just have our canvas set to world space here. And you'll see that I've added this world space UI controller script on it here, which just has a reference to our damage icon prefab. So basically what's going to happen is it's going to go ahead and spawn these damage text prefabs into the world as a child of this UI canvas. I'll just go ahead and enable this, and you can see that it's just basically a simple little text mesh pro object like this. And then through code, we're going to be able to dynamically set the color and text for these UI elements. So back over on the code, here's our world space UI controller. Again, we just have the serialized field for the damage icon prefab. We do also want to get a reference to the main camera's transform, just so we can make sure that we orient our objects so they always face the camera. They kind of billboard to the camera. So you see in the on enable, this is where we basically are listening to the events. So the first thing that we need to do is we actually need to get a reference to our deal damage system in order for us to actually subscribe to the different events. So we can get a reference to this system by using our world.default game object injection world. And there is a get existing system managed function on there. And we can pass in the type of whichever system base system. Again, this will only work for system base systems, not I systems. So we can pass in whichever system base system we want here. And this basically gives us a reference to the existing system in the world for the deal damage system. So once we have the deal damage system, then we can go ahead and subscribe to the events. So you'll see that we're subscribing to the on deal damage, which we can call our display damage icon function. And similarly for the on grant experience, we'll go ahead and subscribe to the display experience icon. Now in on disable, of course, we're just going to want to go ahead and unsubscribe to these events just for proper coding practice here. You'll see that one extra thing that we do need to do is we'll just make sure that the world.default game object injection world actually exists. If it's null, just go ahead and return out of here. It seems to be sometimes, but not necessarily all the time, when we actually exit play mode, we'll get some errors if it tries to actually find the default game object injection world when we're actually quitting the application. So again, we just need to make sure the default game object injection world actually exists before we look for systems and unsubscribe from events and all that. So then here are the actual functions where we're displaying the damage icons out into the world. So you see that we just kind of figure out the initial position and rotation of this damage icon, and we'll just go ahead and do a regular game object instantiate, again passing in our damage icon prefab with our start position, our rotation to the camera, and then we're going to set it as a child of this world space UI so it shows up properly within the game world. And then basically we can just go ahead and say get the TextMesh Pro UGUI component from there, and then using that we can just go ahead and set whatever text that we want on here. So in this case, you'll see that I'm setting the color to red, and then I'm doing a minus. You can kind of see that right there. And then we can actually pass in the variable for the damage amount.toString. And then of course, we'll just go ahead and close off that color tag there. And you'll see that for the display experience icon, again, it's going to be the exact same thing. We're just kind of figuring out where the camera is. Again, just doing a regular game object instantiate of the damage icon prefab, setting it as a child of the same transform. However, this time we'll just go ahead and set the color to yellow. We'll do a plus and then the experience amount, and then we can say EXP after that, and we'll just go ahead and close out our color tag there. So again, what that means is that when one of these enemies gets hit, you'll see that they actually display a little -5 above their head, and then when we actually do finish them off, again, it's going to show the -5 above the enemy's head, but then also the +5 EXP above the player's head. So now the next thing to do is show you kind of how I have this player stats screen set up here. We're actually going to use a MonoBehaviour to read data over on the ECS side. Okay, so again, real quick, I'm just going to show you kind of how I have this set up over in Unity. So you see that I have the screen space UI canvas. Again, if we look at the canvas, we're just set to a screen space mode of overlay. And then again, I've added a screen space UI controller, which has a reference to the stats menu panel, which is kind of this menu panel here, which we're going to be enabling and disabling. We also have a reference to the player experience text because we actually want to display the text of how much experience they have, as well as we just have a little slider just so I can show you that there are multiple ways that we can kind of display data. So if you look over here, again, we basically just have a super simple setup where it's just a panel that we just kind of can toggle on and off with the escape key. And then you'll see that we have the player experience text as well as this slider, which is actually going to be representative of how much experience the player has. So again, there's not really a whole lot of stuff that needs to be set up on the Unity ECS side because again, our player already has this character experience points, which just has this public integer value on here. And then again, in our deal damage system, if our player is actually, gaining experience, we're actually going ahead and increasing the experience in here. So the data has basically already been set over on the ECS side. Now it's really just up to the MonoBehaviour side for us to read that data. So you see that in start, I'm doing a couple things here. Now, admittedly, this is a little bit of a hacky way to do it. It's not necessarily always the cleanest way to get an entity reference from a MonoBehaviour, but this is one way that we can certainly do it. So I've just converted the start method into an IEnumerator here. First thing that I'm going to do is get a reference to the world's entity manager. That's going to allow us to do a couple different things. One of them being get a reference to the entity. And then once we have a reference to the entity, whenever we want to read data from that entity, we're going to be using the entity manager as well. Again, it's pretty easy to get a reference to the entity manager. Just do a world.defaultGameObjectInjectionWorld.entityManager. Now, again, this is where things get a little bit hacky. It's not always that the ECS world is going to be loaded right away when this MonoBehaviour runs. So again, doing something super hacky here where we're just doing a yield return new wait for seconds 0.2f. So it just waits, just a split second of time. And then we're actually going to go ahead and get a reference to our player entity once we're pretty certain that the entity is going to be loaded by this point. Again, there are better ways to do this, but this is just super quick and hacky for now. So again, we'll use our entity manager, and we need to do a create entity query so we can actually query for the particular entity what we're looking for. In this case, we're looking for an entity that has the type of player tag. Once we have our entity query, we can just do a .get singleton entity on that. And so this basically means that if this entity query, which we're creating right here, only has one entity associated with it, this get singleton entity is going to return that entity, and we'll just go ahead and assign that to our player entity here. just have a little debug log statement to make sure that I'm actually, having a correct reference to that, but that's kind of unnecessary. Anyways, you'll see in the on update, basically when I hit the escape key, we're just going to go ahead and flip the show stats variable here and then call our show hide stats menu. So basically what this is going to do is it's going to actually go ahead and enable or disable that stats menu depending on whether we should show it or not. If we should show the menu, then we're actually going to go ahead and look up the component data for the particular player entity. So again, basically what we're going to do here is create a local variable for the current player's experience. Again, we can get that off the entity manager just by doing a get component data. The type that we're looking for is the character experience points. And then again, we're passing in the player entity because we want the character experience off that player entity. And then finally, we do a dot value because again, if we go back to our character experience points, we do actually want this underlying value. What is the actual integer value of how many experience points it has at that given time. So then once we have that value, we can basically just do whatever we want with it. So you'll see that I'm setting the player experience text here to player exp and then passing in the current player's experience. And then also for our slider, I'm going to go ahead and set the value to the current player's experience as well. So now basically what this means is whenever I hit the escape key, we can kind of toggle the player stats on or off. You'll see that right now the player's experience is at 0 points. And if we go ahead and say destroy this first enemy right here, you see that we gained +5 experience. And we can go ahead and again show our player stats. You'll see that the player's experience is now up to 5 and the slider has incremented a little bit. We'll go ahead and do the same thing with the second entity here. We'll just go ahead and shoot 3 projectiles out. You see that we gained 5 experience. If we hit the escape key, you'll see that we're now up to 10. There is one downside of this because we're only reading data when we actually open that menu up. So if I say, for example, go ahead and shoot out 3 projectiles at that enemy, when I already have that menu open, you'll see that the +5 experience did show up above the player, but this player experience did not update in real time because again, we're only reading that data just that first time when we open the menu. However, if I close the menu and then reopen the menu, you'll see that the player's experience has now been updated to 15. So this again was just kind of like a simple approach where I'm basically just reading the data once when we open up that menu. But if you do need that data to be updated in real time, you do need to make that consideration and structure your code appropriately. So anyways, once again, those are 2 different ways that we can actually display Unity ECS data using Unity's UI system. One thing I didn't go over is how to basically hook into Unity's UI events, such as like button clicks and things like that, to actually trigger things over on the ECS side. Now, this may be a topic for its own video, but essentially you're going to want to do an approach kind of similar to the second read value approach, where we're basically using a MonoBehaviour. We have a reference to our entity manager, and with that entity manager, we can basically do anything on the ECS side that we want. So we can say, add component data, or we can set component data. So that's probably what you would end up doing in that type of case. But do let me know if you would like me to do a dedicated video on that and maybe some other things related to triggering events from the MonoBehaviour side and having things happen over on the ECS side. So anyways, if you enjoyed today's video and you found it helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button. Also subscribe to the channel for lots more videos much like this one. Again, I do want to be doing more of these videos where I'm showcasing you how to kind of bridge the gap between existing Unity features and Unity ECS. A couple ones that I do want to do in the short term here are the new input system, Cinemachine, and maybe something with animations, but definitely open to suggestions, so feel free to leave those down in the comment section below. Of course, if you do have any questions, you can ask those in the comment section or join us over on Discord over at tmg.dev/discord. Anyways, hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.